Calvinists tired of people ripping on John Calvin? Here's a small clip just to show you what I mean.
The Calvinist apologists can, forgive me, lie all you want, rewrite history all you want, but the historical record is there. And years after Servetus was killed unjustly, absurdly, for his doctrinal beliefs, Calvin boasted how he had exterminated Michael Servetus, the Spaniard. He might have been racist, too, with that statement. Believing in the Trinity or not believing the Trinity is not a death penalty. It's not the death penalty towards any normal born-again person. It wouldn't enter the mind of a Christian to kill someone over their understanding of God. But see, not only did it enter Calvin's mind, Calvin made sure it happened.
Just look at the way this man snarls as he spews his hate for Calvin. And then he has the audacity to use the word providence in his username. This was just a small clip, but you can find people like this all over YouTube and all over the internet. But what upsets me is that a man on our side that should be standing up for John Calvin apologizes for him to try to appease people like Providence 1611. Listen to John Piper.
If I could change one thing about John Calvin, it would be that he not have been a part of the Servetus affair. I mean, everybody who loves what they have learned from John Calvin wishes that they didn't have to apologize for the fact that even though he didn't want Servetus to be burned at the stake, but done something, executed in a more humane way, he was in favor of executing Michael Servetus for his heretical views of the Trinity.
I'm sorry, Mr. Piper, but we have no reason to hide our head in shame over John Calvin. The man was a godly man, and I believe he did not sin in that affair with Servetus. Servetus was tried and condemned in a just court of law, and deserved to die under the laws of that time period. I want you to listen to James White explain the story between Calvin and Servetus. This is an excerpt from The Dividing Line.
We continue with our examination of some of the claims of Dan Barker in the last program. I sort of finished up really quickly at the end with about a 4-minute run through some of the issues that Dan Barker forgets to mention when discussing the subject of John Calvin. But I knew there was a second section of his exchange with Doug Wilson I wanted to play first because I find it quite interesting. So let's listen to after the opening statements and the rebuttals. Then there was some cross-examination, and here's what Dan Barker had to say later on after that presentation we heard last time about John Calvin.
Doug.
Okay, so we heard about John Calvin burning a man to death who committed no crime, who violated no law in that city or in that area, who broke no scriptural law, who simply disagreed with John Calvin's authority. He was burned to death along with his book. So I want to ask you, was John Calvin a good man?
John Calvin was a good man, not a perfect man, not a sinless man, but he was a good man. Yes.
Okay, well, you heard a man whose vanity and ego is so offended because someone disagreed with him, publicly burns him at the stake. A truly good man like Michael Servetus, who did exactly what John Calvin himself did by dissenting from the church.
Demas has the right to kill anybody he wants.
Well, I'm not arguing for Demas as a god, by the way. You misconstrued my argument. But
the people of Europe had the right to kill Servetus if they wanted.
So John Calvin, the murderer, was a good man, according to you.
The people of Europe, Lutherans, Roman Catholics, and...
It was John Calvin's decision. His vanity was offended.
Okay, let's stop there because there's just so many errors to address that eventually you start losing track of all of them. I don't I would assume that Dan Barker is reading some bad material on the subject of John Calvin. He's probably reading atheist material. I know, looking at his book, Godless, looking at the section where he attempts to present contradictions, they really do reflect the worst that Prometheus puts out, let's put it that way. And if you aren't going to engage in meaningful biblical exegesis in the assertions of your contradictions, then it's not overly surprising that you would not do much in the way of history. Many people hear about Michael Servetus as the chief argument against John Calvin. I would simply like to suggest to you that if Servetus is an argument for rejecting John Calvin as a good man, then Servetus is an argument for rejecting that almost anyone alive in 1553 was a good man. And what I mean by that is that the governments that existed in Europe in 1553 were absolutely united in their condemnation of Miguel Servetus. In fact, I don't believe that you would find Servetus arguing for freedom of religion. In fact, he was arguing in his Restitutio, the book that came out in January of 1553, which was a direct shot at the Institutio, the Institutes of John Calvin, that it was his view that should be adopted. Yes, Calvin, in a sense, laid the seed that would grow into the concept of freedom of religion. But it was not something that had yet come into any type of maturity at all. In fact, you could say its growth had only just begun with the Anabaptists and the Radical Reformation, which at that time was in great disrepute because of what happened at Munster. And so when we think about what happened with Servetus, Barker tries to present it as if this was something that Calvin did. What he does not tell you is twofold. Let's first start with Calvin's history with Servetus. He describes them as friends. Calvin never described Servetus as his friend, and neither would Servetus have described Calvin as his friend. That's just simply inaccurate. Instead, you have two men who were contemporaries, born within about a year of each other. And yet, both very brilliant. I think Servetus saw in Calvin an intellect equal to his own. Servetus was a brilliant man, but he was not a balanced man at all. He was truly all over the place as far as the things that he studied. He's been credited with describing the circulatory system, though I've never really tracked down exactly where that comes from as to whether that's really accurate or not. But he studied astrology. He studied a wide variety of things at various points in his life. And in fact, just prior to 1553, after an extensive attempted correspondence on his part, it's very interesting, in the middle 1540s, he sent as many as 30 letters to Calvin. Calvin simply refused to talk to him. He reminds me a little bit of somebody who's constantly sending me letters, and I never respond to them either, who is a little bit on the imbalanced side. But Calvin would not respond to him. The man was not a nice person. I don't know where Barker gets this wonderful, truthful, kind man, Michael Servetus. What really needs to be understood is that early on, shortly after Calvin's conversion, he was prevailed upon to meet with Michael Servetus in an attempt, as Calvin put it, to win him to the Lord. Already Servetus's heresies were well known, even though his books were not nearly as well known as they would be later on. But his heresies were well known, especially on the doctrine of the Trinity. And at that time in Europe, if you were a non-Trinitarian, you were a glowing heretic. And that was considered a crime against the state. That was the case under Rome. That was the case under the magisterial Reformation. And Calvin risked his life to meet with Michael Servetus, and Servetus never showed. So Calvin risked his life, and Servetus didn't show up. So immediately, if you risked your life to meet with someone to try to talk to them on theological issues, and they never showed up, I don't know about you, but I would probably be somewhat hesitant in the future to really put out a whole lot of effort to communicate with this particular individual. Then, starting around, as I recall, 1545, Servetus, at this time living under the name of Michael Villanueva, because his own name would have had him arrested by the Inquisition, who was personal doctor to the Archbishop in a city in France, began corresponding with Calvin. And Calvin immediately knew who it was. Even though it was Michael Villanueva, he knew that this was Servetus. And again, Calvin, he approached Calvin as people always do. We've gotten used to this in our IRC chat channel. People will come in and, I just have a few questions. Yeah, okay. You have to be careful, because sometimes people do just have a few questions. But in the vast majority of instances where someone's coming in, which we call them a lamer, someone who's actually coming in to just start a fight or try to draw people off or find some disciples for themselves, whatever it might be, they love to come in and, I just have some questions. And of course, what are those questions? What are those questions? They are objections, disguised as questions. And this is how Servetus approached Calvin. Well, Calvin took the time to respond, and Servetus's responses would always be nasty. Calvin even took the time to send him a copy of the Institutes of the Christian Religion, which Servetus sent back with what we might call nastygrams written in the margins. And I wanted to give you an example of some of these nastygrams. Remember, this is 8 years prior to him showing up in Geneva. Here's one of the things that Servetus writes to Calvin during this period of time. I have often told you that triad of impossible monstrosities that you admit in God is not proved by any scriptures properly understood. Or later on, this shows that your knowledge is ridiculous, nay, a magical enchantment and a lying justification, and so on. So much that even Bolsec described Servetus as a man known for arrogance and insolence. And so, after the first, he also, by the way, sent to Calvin a manuscript of his upcoming book that he was working on, which again is denial of the doctrine of the Trinity and various and sundry other issues along with it. And Calvin refused to return it. He in fact, after about the second letter he sent to him, just refused to have anything to do with him at all. He wrote over 30 letters to Calvin, and Calvin just said, not doing anything, not responding to this man in any way, shape, or form. And after that, Servetus basically started focusing upon end times. He was the Harold Camping of his day. He actually came up with a date. Folks, Hal Lindsey was a late comer. Let me assure you. Hal Lindsey was a late comer. In fact, let me again see if I can get you the specific dates here. What was the dates he had come up with? I saw them here just a few moments ago. I was somewhere between 15. Why can't I find it? I should have marked it, but I didn't want to mark this book up. This is called Dead Air, which is not a good thing to do. This is why Rush, keeps talking at this point in time. It's somewhere between like 1555 and 1585, as I recall, was the time period he came up with. That's when it was all supposed to be wrapped up. So in other words, that was right around the corner. So the Jehovah's Witnesses and everybody else, they're latecomers. People have been doing this for a long, long time. So he really wasn't focused on that kind of thing for a while. But then something happened in 1553. Remember, I forgot something here. Remember that Calvin knew where Michael Villanueva was. He knew where Servetus was. He knew the pseudonym he was using. And he could have turned that information over to the Roman Catholics, but he didn't. He could have betrayed him, but he didn't. Not that he liked the man, not that he approved of his heresy or anything along the lines of that, but he didn't. What happened was a man in Geneva was trying to convert a relative of his who was a Roman Catholic. And he was aware of the fact, Calvin had mentioned to some of his close friends, that Villanueva, Servetus, was actually living in a Roman Catholic country, and in fact was in the employ of the archbishop of a major city. And so in a letter, this man said to his Roman Catholic relative, he said, look, in Geneva, we are truly concerned about truth and Christian doctrine, and we would not put up with someone like that infamous heretic, Michael Servetus, who is living in a Roman Catholic country and is in service of an archbishop. Well, his correspondent immediately turned that over to the authorities, who immediately went to Villanueva, and he denied everything. I'm not Michael Servetus. No, that's not me. No. And so they wrote back to the reformed man in Geneva and said, You've made an accusation here against this man. You need to back it up. And so he went to Calvin, and as he himself said, had to plead with Calvin, had to convince Calvin to give over the documentation that would be needed to demonstrate that Michael Villanueva was actually Michael Servetus. And since there was a legal proceeding ongoing, he felt that that was what he should do. But you'll notice, here's the what the man said. But I will tell you one thing, I had the greatest difficulty in getting them out of Monsieur Calvin. Not that he wants such execrable blasphemies to go unreproved, but because it seems to him that his duty, as one who does not bear the sword of justice, is to convict heresies by doctrine rather than by pursuing them with the sword. But I was so importunate with him, remonstrating that I should be accused of levity unless he helped me, that in the end he agreed to let me have what you see. Well, he sent along portions of Servetus' manuscript and enough information to demonstrate that Michael Villanueva was the one who'd written these letters and was in fact Michael Servetus. So that's how he became known to the Inquisition. That's how he was arrested. And while on trial, in his nightshirt, he snuck over the wall while he asked the guard to use the restroom, and jumped up on top of the outhouse, in essence, and jumped over the wall and escaped. But he, for some odd reason, made a beeline for Geneva. There's a lot of discussion as to why that was and why that would be. I think he knew that his jig was up and he wanted to take on Calvin. And many speculate that this was one of the most difficult times for Calvin in Geneva. Why? Well, something that Mr. Barker doesn't seem to understand is that John Calvin was not even a citizen of Geneva at this time. He became a citizen in 1559. This is 1553. His book had come out in January, that is Servetus's, and he knew that in the past few elections, everything had gone against Calvin in Geneva. And so many believe, and there's reason to believe this given how Servetus behaved when he got there, that he thought that the enemies of Calvin would be able to be convinced to side with him against Calvin. And in fact, even once he was arrested in Geneva and put in prison, he demanded that Calvin be put in prison as long as he was prosecuting him. Now remember, the chief minister, since this was a theological issue, would be under obligation to be the prosecutor in this case. But it was not the minister or the ministers who did the arresting or the punishing. When people say that Calvin had Servetus burned, they are misrepresenting the historical situation. They try to present it as if Calvin was this autocrat. He ruled Geneva. That is not the case. Anyone who has read anything about the history of the situation knows that's not the case. So you have the personal history, and then you have the situation at the time of Servetus' arrest. And that is that Calvin is fighting hard to maintain his position. Servetus immediately makes contact with those in the city who are Calvin's enemies. And he attempts to have Calvin arrested on charges of heresy. Years before, a man had accused Calvin of heresy in regards to Arianism and a denial of the deity of Christ. He brought those things back up. He wanted Calvin put on trial and hoped to see him destroyed. In fact, he even filed a motion accusing Calvin of simony, accusing Calvin of doing what he did to gain money, and everybody knew that Calvin was not a man with a love for money, but he still made the accusation, and filed it in such a way that he wanted to receive Calvin's home and property if he prevailed in his suit against Calvin. So this is not a man who's just sitting there, sitting idly by going, oh, I'm just such an innocent person. He, to the end, not only maintained his position, but he fought to have Calvin accused along these lines as well. And so when Barker tries to tell us that Calvin's ego was hurt, it was just a little disagreement, this is absurd. It is absurd beyond the level of absurdity. Because, you see, the Genevans wrote to the other Swiss cantons, and all of the Swiss cantons, without exception, insisted that Servetus had to die by burning. All of them. They wrote to... Now remember, the Inquisition, after he escaped, burned him in effigy along with a few bales of paper representing his books. So we know what they thought about it. So it was very clear what the Roman Catholics thought about Michael Servetus. All the Swiss cantons said he must die. They wrote to Philip Melanchthon. Philip Melanchthon, Luther's successor, was not like Luther. He was, I think last time I described him as somewhat squishy. And yet Melanchthon wrote back and said it is necessary that Servetus be punished, that he die. This was the united voice of all the governments of Europe. See, they try to present it as if Calvin was just doing something, and everybody's like, oh, but we can't stop Calvin, and as if this is some unusual thing. If Calvin is to be convicted of something, is to be convicted of living in 1553. He did nothing out of the norm whatsoever in any way, shape, or form. He was not there at the burning, lighting the fires. In fact, the ministers specifically asked that Servetus receive a quicker and less painful execution. And the little council, which is the secular council, which is the council that burned Servetus, the little council refused. They did not allow even for what the ministers asked to take place. And even up until the night before his execution, Calvin went to Servetus and sought to try to convince him of the errors of his ways. And I want to read you some of the things that he said. I brought the wrong book. I apologize. That's not in this one. I can't tell you. But to make a long story short, he sought. This was not a man gloating over the destruction of this person. This is not anything like what Dan Barker and others try to present. Here is a man who, you've got to give Calvin his props. He was consistent. The reason that he opposed Servetus, the reason he prosecuted Servetus, is because he truly believed that his viewpoints were a cancer. And now that he was convicted and was about to be executed, he sought to see him, before that happened, repent of his heresies and his errors, and did not receive any indication from him that he did that. And in fact, it was Guillaume Farel, not John Calvin, who accompanied him to the execution. And so it's simply a matter of being balanced. It's simply a matter of allowing the historical facts to speak. It's so easy to use this kind of argumentation against people of the past. I hate to say it, but this is how Dave Hunt acts. Dave Hunt does the exact same thing in regards to the Servetus incident as well. And it is meant to, it's an obviously illogical argumentation. Well, if Calvin was a mean, terrible, horrible, nasty man, then Calvinism must be unbiblical. Try to follow the logic on that one for a moment, and eventually you'll explode. Because there is no logic to it. But that is the kind of argumentation that you get. And with postmodernists in our day, and especially with the next generation that unfortunately is historically ignorant on a level that is difficult to even begin to comprehend, it works real well. People today are more than willing to anachronistically apply our standards today to people who lived before. And I don't know about you, but I sure hope that people living 50 or 100, 150 years from now will not judge me on the basis of an anachronistic historical methodology. And if you have concerns about things like that, then you would, I think, understand that as well. But that's what people do. And so it's a cheap argument. It's a cheap debating point. You know that in a debate, the other guy's never going to have enough time to actually, fix these things up and give you a context at all. And so that's how you get away with that kind of thing. And so I want to expand out on that a little bit. I went through it very quickly before. But especially if, we talk to a lot of folks on this program. You're attempting to bring reform to your church. You're attempting to encourage people to think biblically, and they discover this name Calvin, and I've not Googled it, but something would tell me that probably on the first page, if you Google John Calvin, you're going to find references to Michael Servetus. And I've mentioned before, the very first time I ever heard about John Calvin and Calvinism was in a Watchtower article about Michael Servetus. And so that kind of stuff is out there. And so you need to know, and you need to have some backgrounds so you have some understanding of what this was all about. Calvin was not running around with a lighted torch in his hand, lighting people up right and left around Geneva just for the fun of it. You can definitely, as a Baptist, I like to go through this story, and then I like to play the movie The Radicals, which gives the other side, in a sense, of what it was like to be persecuted by the magisterial reformers. As a Baptist, the magisterial reformation, which places that power in the hands of the secular authority, is dangerous. And many of my forefathers died through that. And I would disagree with the magisterial reformation. But the fact of the matter is, that's all there was in that day. And I want to look at anybody like a Dave Hunt who says, well, he should have known better. I want to look him in the eyes and say, you really think that in that day, when Europe had known nothing for centuries prior to this, of quote-unquote religious freedom, that you not only would have seen all the errors of Rome, that your vision is so clear of the Bible without tradition, that you would have gone as far as they did and even farther to a perfectly consistent position? You want to look me in the eye and tell me you'd do that? And the sad thing is, I think Dave Hunt would. I really think he would. When the man can look at me and say, I have no traditions, then I think he would say, well, of course, I'd just pick up the Bible and read it. And that's how it would go. So, anyway, I wanted to expand out on that a little bit.